Ladies and gentlemen, today we are bringing you breaking news. Just kidding. Well, sort of. Today, just recently, they announced what is called the Pandora Papers. Now, of course, we've seen many of these leaks in the past. We had the Panama Papers, we had the Paradise Papers, we had the Lux Papers, I think we had a few others. Various different leaks of various organizations, law firms, service providers, etc., about what is going on in the international offshore world. And this is, I guess, technically the biggest. So I'm going to go through with you today a little bit about what this is. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the things we can learn about this from, not like about the actual leak itself, but I think learn from it about if you care about your privacy, etc. I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is that people are building international structures, what I think kind of the fallout of this sort of thing is, and some of the kind of go forward changes, etc. So we're going to talk about all of that coming up. Before we do that, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, nail the notification bell, hit the all notifications, make sure you don't miss out on any videos. If you'd like help with any of this international offshore stuff, setting up trusts, companies, bank accounts, getting residencies, citizenships, tax optimization, building, the most efficient legal structures, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer, link in the description below, or send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so I'm going to start by kind of reading just briefly to you and commenting on this from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which is the organization that principally released the Pandora Papers, as they are calling Pandora's box, and I'll give you a little bit of context on it, okay? ICIJ's largest ever investigation on the offshore world unlocks financial secrets of politicians, billionaires, and the global elite. Terrible, isn't it? Those terrible people. The Pandora Papers investigation lays bare the global entanglement of political power and secretive offshore finance. Of course, it is certainly true that to some extent you have corruption which is hidden by various different international corporate structures, right? That's certainly true. I'm going to comment as I go along through some of these things which might help you figure out some of what's likely to change in the wake of these types of things, okay? Based upon the most expansive leak of tax haven files in history, the investigation reveals the secret deals and hidden assets of more than 330 politicians and high-level public officials in more than 90 countries and territories, including 35 leaders, ambassadors, mayors, ministers, presidential advisors, generals, and a central bank governor appear in the files. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, a nonprofit newsroom and a network of journalists centered in Washington, D.C., obtained more than 11.9 million financial records containing 2.94 terabits of confidential information from 14 offshore service providers, enterprises that set up and manage shell companies and trusts in tax havens around the world. So first, few things here just to note. Number one, I do always find it interesting that it's confidential documents. Why aren't these guys being sued? Why aren't there being charges pressed? Why aren't there being, you would think there would be something going on there, because there's a reason that, confidential is confidential, right? It's private information, shouldn't actually be leaked to the public. So that's something to be aware of. Next, I do find it kind of interesting how this is like a bunch of organizations now that have had their information leaked. In my opinion, it's kind of an advantage of working with a smaller firm versus a big firm, right? If you're in a situation where you go to a large firm, what's the risk of large firms? Well, first of all, there's a lot of possible data leak points, right? If you've got 1,000 people who work at that company or 100 people who work at that company, etc., every person represents another opportunity for a leak of information. So if you're trying to maintain privacy, generally working with a smaller circle is better, right? It's just the way that it goes. So something to consider in that regard. The files reveal secret offshore holdings of more than 130 billionaires from 45 countries, including 46 Russian oligarchs. In 2021, according to Forbes, 100 of the billionaires had a collective fortune of more than 600 billion. Other clients include bankers, big political donors, arms dealers, international criminals, pop stars, spy chiefs, and sporting giants. Of course, throwing that in there to make them all kind of be the same. ICIJ shared the files with 150 media partners, launching the broadest collaboration in journalism history. For nearly 2 years, ICIJ organized and led an investigation that grew to encompass more than 600 journalists in 117 countries and territories. Reporters followed leads to a cliffside mansion in California, a sugar plantation in the Dominican Republic, a polluting factory in Italy, high-rise towers in Dubai, and a Turkish hospital where workers alleged mistreatment. Where workers alleged mistreatment, sorry. Of course, like, what those two things have that much to do with each other, I don't know. But anyway, the documents span 5 decades, with most created between 1996 and 2020, and include information on more than 29,000 beneficial owners, the ultimate owners of offshore assets. That is more than twice the number of owners found 5 years ago in the Panama Papers investigation, which was based on a leak from a single law firm. While owning an offshore company is legal, the secrecy it provides can give cover to illicit money flows, enabling bribery, money laundering, tax evasion, terrorism financing, human trafficking, and other human rights abuses, experts say. Of course, not who these experts are or anything. The Pandora Papers set off fresh insights into the international corruption scandals, including the far-reaching bribery operation of the Brazilian contracting giant, I don't know how to pronounce this, and the international soccer scandal known as FIFAgate, and the alleged looting of the Venezuelan public assets. So there is something to be said for, truthfully, when you have government officials. I would, one of the things they're going to talk about here is the King of Jordan. I don't know if you can throw somebody like a king in the same category when they're like a dictator and they have absolute power. But when you have publicly elected officials, transparency, I think there's something to be said for it, right? Like, do you really want the Prime Minister of Canada or Australia or something to be going and doing things with government resources, etc.? Of course you don't. And so there's like this really fine balance that I think I'd love to hear from you guys on, in how do we balance privacy and transparency, because these both have value in society, right? There's obviously a clear value of transparency and there's a clear value of privacy, and partially it's from whom, partially it's in what circumstances, etc. But this is a challenge that we as a society are struggling with. I don't think it's really going to go away. I think that more and more the investigative capabilities of identifying who is who are going to get better and better, and so you're going to rely on more and more indirect or really intense methods if you want to truly remain private, but at the same time, you want some degree of transparency from a societal standpoint, and figuring out that balance. Like, do I think that a bunch of journalists should be allowed to just publish people's private information? Really, no. I'm not a fan of that. Poor nations are disproportionately harmed by the stashing of wealth in tax havens, which starves treasuries of funds to pay for roads, schools, and hospitals. The Pandora Papers probe reveals that international leaders who could tackle offshore tax avoidance have themselves secretly moved money and assets to the reach of tax and law enforcement authorities as their citizens struggle. Are these countries disproportionately harmed? Well, I mean, if you're in a country like the US, then they just print money in order to pay for something. And if you're in a country like, I don't know, Uganda, your ability to just print money isn't really so much the same. So I guess in that sense, maybe. I think that it's worth thinking about, why is it that people are doing these things to begin with? And I think that's like a really important question, Like, I think that an investigation like this reveals precisely part of the problem that people have. People don't want everyone to know their affairs, and rightly so. Do I want to know what property, or want people to be able to just know what property I buy, to know where I live, to know what my finances are, my financial transactions? No. I don't know if I necessarily believe in the concept of rights per se in that sense. Just in what I mean by this is, some information is going to get out, and that's going to be the case, right? Celebrities, people are going to know about. But does it make sense that I should want to protect my privacy and not have a stigma against it for that? I think that's perfectly reasonable. So something to consider. Current and former leaders who have owned secret companies and trusts, as revealed by the Pandora Papers investigation, include King Abdullah II of Jordan, Prime Minister of Côte d'Ivoire and Czech Republic, the presidents of Ecuador, Kenya, and Gabon, and the former presidents of El Salvador, Panama, Paraguay, and Honduras. again, nothing particularly to say that, and this is one of the problems I have with these types of leaks, is, are you alleging that there was something criminal here? Because if not, what's the point? Like, okay, somebody owned a company that was registered abroad. So what? Often, especially if, look at this. Kenya, Gabon, Ecuador, El Salvador, Paraguay, Honduras. Do I want to store assets in those countries? Not especially. Is it therefore a problem that I would have foreign legal entities and stash assets somewhere else? Not especially. Like, it's this very bizarre, like it's an attack. You can tell there's a political agenda behind these sorts of things. Anyway, the files also shed light on the financial dealings of Chavez people in Venezuela, fugitive cult leaders and their followers, kleptocrats and their families, neo-Nazis, a mineral water dealer convicted of soliciting the murder of a judge and a prosecutor, a fugitive millionaire pedophile, and a terrorism financier. Other players in the Pandora Papers global cast include a Bitcoin czar sentenced for money laundering in connection with the largest ever heist in history. Offshore investments were linked to Bollywood actors, soccer stars, corrupt sports officials, a king's lover, feuding princesses, movie directors and stars, supermodels, acclaimed designers, world-famous singers. We call the project Pandora Papers because this collaboration builds upon the legacy of Panama and Paradise Papers, and the ancient myths of Pandora's box still evokes an outpouring of trouble and woe. So I won't go through and finish reading the rest, but one of the things that I think is really interesting in this is they really called out the fact that the U.S. is increasingly popular. It mentions in here how a bunch of money flowed to South Dakota trust providers. Certainly one of the things that has happened in recent years is more and more I actually advocate people to set up trusts in the U.S., in particular if they're foreign, as opposed to offshore. Places like Nevis, Cook Islands get a lot of attention, but in certain situations, and it requires proper planning, you have to figure out what makes sense. Often actually you get as much or more privacy with better fiduciaries and better infrastructure in some place like Nevada than you do in some of those other places, simply because of the supporting ecosystem. Now, there's no one size fits all. That's always a problem that people have, is, what's the best country for this, etc. The reality is there is no best country for it, but it's everyone's based on their individual circumstances. So I do think one of the possible outfalls of this is that more pressure comes internally on the U.S. to crack down on these sorts of things, and you start to see more restrictions in the U.S. similar to how you see more restrictions in Europe. So that'll be one interesting thing that could happen over the next while, which could make it a little bit tougher for people trying to do business in the U.S., especially from abroad. So that's something to watch out for coming up. Next, I think this highlights, in addition to, I mentioned, small firm versus large firm, if you're looking for privacy, and sometimes that's what people want, right? They want privacy, they want protection, perfectly legitimate, not anything wrong with what they're doing, etc. But you really need to be aware of, and I'll do a separate video on this about how to protect yourself. You have to consider what is the process by which you get the assets in, what is the process by which the assets are stored, and what is the process by which assets are taken out. And if you miss any of those three steps, you can screw it up. You also, I think, should pay attention to the fact that a lot of people focus today on things like FATCA, CRS, government exchange of information agreements, etc. And then what happens? You get some sort of a journalistic leak like this, where you get some disgruntled employee, etc., who leaks that information. So if you actually care about deep levels of privacy, what you kind of need to do is keep the circle tight and employ proper technology to do it. So that's something. Here, I mean, they're grabbing records that go way, way back. One of the questions is, okay, why was there no procedures in place in order to eliminate those old records? Realistically, talking about records from 30, 40 years ago, there's no reason to really keep those at this point in time. And so that's kind of interesting just shows you how internal procedures for managing information could be tightened up, and probably is a competitive advantage. That's something that we'll probably work more and more on inside Offshore Citizen, Offshore Capitalist over the next while, is really demonstrating the degree to which information can be kept encrypted, the extent to which information when it's no longer relevant can be deleted, etc., so that it's not at risk of some sort of a data breach. Fortunately, in our case, we're very boutique, and so we work with a relatively small number of clients, etc., and so there isn't really the same degree of vulnerability that you get if you're a big firm. But that being said, I think it is worth understanding what the possible weak points are. I'd be interested to know what happened here. Was it that somebody gave out the information? Was it that they hacked them? Was it, what exactly happened? Because it certainly strikes me that a lot of people should be getting fired and probably convicted. And so it's funny that, you have criminal behavior accusing people of, unethical behavior. I read another article where they were commenting that, tax evasion is unethical because it goes for or it wasn't tax evasion. They specifically said tax avoidance, which is not illegal at all. And they were like, well, it's legal, but, it's unethical because it goes around the spirit even though it follows the letter of the law. And you're like, well, that's the way that law works. So anyway, those are some thoughts that I have on it. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. What do you think is coming up? I think, obviously over the last 10 years or so, we've seen an increasingly concentrated effort to go after people with wealth. There's kind of this sense of naming and shaming that happens, right, as a strategy to try and bring things out. And it's increasing the risk factor for various participants. I don't think that it's always a negative thing. As I said, you can go and watch read the book $1 Billion Whale and read about the 1MDB scandal. There was some stuff there where, hey, listen, it just shouldn't have been allowed to happen. And having some transparency is good, especially when you're talking about government transparency. However, this being said, like I said, it's like they're not really recognizing the other side of it, which I think is perfectly legitimate. So that's what we're here for. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Would love to hear from you guys, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.